Okay, so I learned this through doing some research. There was no slaves in Egypt. Okay, and what I mean by that is the concept of slavery was different. So people think they had slavery, and yes, they had slavery, but it's not slavery like we know it. And so, okay, what is that? Yeah, exactly. Roll your eyes. So it's funny because once I studied this, there's different forms of slavery and different versions, and I was like, okay, whatever. So pretty much what they're trying to say, the long, stupid way, is they didn't have slaves. They call it slavery, but if it's not the same as what we think of slavery, then how about we just call it something else? Because you know what it really was? They forced people to work as, like, punishments or like blah, blah, blah. And they had work camps and things like that. But it wasn't like people were bought. It wasn't like people were taken against their will and sold to other people. People weren't rounded up and sold as objects. It was not slavery in that aspect. The slaves or the forced work that they had in their society was normally as a punishment. Like, yeah, nowadays we do community service or like, so yeah, it was like sometimes a punishment or, but yeah, or a job or like, maybe they didn't want to do it for this reason or that, but, but people weren't bought and sold. And another big, important, interesting step of that whole thing is that, okay, the Egyptians that built the pyramids were black. The ancient African Egyptians, the very first people, were black people. And that is not up for debate. That is the truth. Who would have ever thought that the Africans originated in Africa and then spread throughout the world? But yeah, so, okay. Egypt, for most of its history, has been a multicultural society. But the original people from that land are black. And I know that might be hard for you to wrap your mind around, that Africans came from Africa. But it's true. And we're not talking about, like, Milano skin, like mixed looking, like Arabian type people. Like, we're talking about as black as you've ever seen. One of the old Herodotus, or one of those people that the old philosophers said excessively black, which is totally racist, and that is racist. But that is a descriptive that tells you what people in that area of the world were. Okay, it is Africa. Egypt is Africa. They're in the middle of the desert. Okay, their black skin is literally meant to protect you from the sun in the desert. I'm sorry. Or whatever, you know what I mean? But that's an obvious scientific fact. That's a blatant thing. People that lived in sun atmospheres like that, you know how, like, polar bears adapted to be white, to be able to blend into the ice because it helped in evolution and biology, like, morph them to be able to blend in and help their environment so that they could survive. And it's like, oh, so maybe skin and the sun and the melanin or the black pigment, or, maybe there's something there, and maybe that's science. Maybe it's obvious that the people that built the pyramids were black. And so maybe I'll just put it that way. Maybe it's super obvious. And it's funny because this is going to be an interesting little side tangent. Hold on. So, mummies, okay? Oh, mummies. When you rot away, let's say you're a white person and you get mummified and you die. Oh yeah, your skin rots away. So when we dig you up, you're going to be black. You're going to be black, right? You're going to be black. But it's funny because this mummification process, they tried so hard to well preserve their bodies. It's interesting because, there's a whole big debate and there's a whole big weird thing because it's like, maybe the people were just black. Maybe the reason that you dig up these bodies and they look black is because they were black. And it's so funny because there's a whole big argument there, but it's funny because they were like, oh, so when bodies rot away, they turn black. And it's like, oh, but didn't they do this whole process to make sure that they didn't really decay as much? And then they put them in this thing that's like buried underground in this thing. They did all this to try to preserve themselves. So maybe the people that you're digging up are just black. And it's funny because they know that they're black. The whole thing's not secret, like I said before. It's all just well-known knowledge that's been suppressed. But like I said, side tangent, sorry about this whole thing, but no, they're totally black. And it's funny because, yeah, it shouldn't even be a question or up for debate or whatever. It's kind of obvious in a lot of ways. But at the same time, one of the reasons why that's important is because, okay, when you say that the pyramid was built by slaves, and then you realize that, the people that built the pyramid were black, you know what that insinuates? It insinuates that black people did slavery before we did. Whether that's what they say out loud or not, and say, oh, no, black people did slavery way before us. Remember the pyramids? Yeah, they enslaved people. Okay, so they didn't, though. So they didn't. The people that built the pyramids were black, and they didn't enslave anybody. Okay, they didn't have slaves like that. So black people didn't do slavery first. Okay, but so that's interesting. And yeah, it's funny because the whole mummy thing is a whole separate side tangent. It's just like, I just felt like that was kind of relevant, but it's like that's a whole other path, and I'm not going to get involved with that whole thing. But it's like, okay, so yeah, they're black, or whatever, Yeah. Okay. So, anyways. But okay, so, and I know a lot of people are going to get mad about, like, when I say that the Egyptians were black and there was no slaves, and some of these things are controversial. I say there's no slaves, and everybody's like, what do you mean? or I say that the Egyptians were probably like super black, people were just like, oh my god. And I'm just like, like I saw this on Facebook. It started this whole argument, this whole thing. Everybody had something to say about it. And I just thought like like it wasn't something I posted. I was just reading through the stuff and I was just like dang, people really care. People really have opinions. And it's funny because it's Africa. So it's Africa, okay? It's fucking Africa. It's like 2 + 2 type shit. It's fucking Africa, okay? You know what I mean? So, Jesus Christ. But it's like, what the fuck, you know what I mean? But so something interesting about that too, though, is people are like, oh no, they weren't Africans. There's white people in Egypt. Ah, I'm offended now. So, okay. So, I'll humor you. Because, okay, think about this. That old phrase, Cleopatra is as old to us as the pyramids were to her. Yeah, like when Cleopatra was around, the pyramids were like 2,000 years old. And to us, Cleopatra is about 2,000 years old. So she's as old to us as the pyramids were to her. That old phrase. So yeah, that's a phrase that's supposed to show you how old the pyramids really are. So when Cleopatra was ruling or when she was there or whatever, the pyramids were already 2,000 years old. But so it's interesting to think about, okay, so I said that the Egyptians that made the pyramids were black, okay? Which is 2,000 years before Cleopatra, okay? It's interesting because when Cleopatra was there, 2,000 years later, I do think that Egypt was a multicultural society. And so, that's interesting, isn't it? Oh, so all of a sudden, wait a minute, back up. Are you telling me that there was a melting pot of different races? So there was a multicultural society? 2,000, 4,000, however many thousand years ago? Yeah. Okay. So for those of you that are confused, like, oh, but white people and mulattoes and oh, the Arabians and people live in Africa that aren't, oh, what's happening? Okay. So yeah. So the black people started there, okay? And over time, Egypt became a multicultural society. And so that's what's funny is because, when it goes back to all the mummies that we dig up are black. It's very interesting because, we haven't ever, for sure, buried a white person and then dug them up 3,000 or 4,000 years later and seen if he's still white. We haven't done that experiment. We're just assuming that bodies that rot away for thousands of years turn black. But you want to know what's hilarious is we don't know that. All the mummies that we found are black, but that could just be because they're all black. But we assume it's because, okay, so it's like, if you bury a black person, then what do you dig him up and he's white, or is he just blacker, or what I mean? And it's like, okay, so yeah, your skin gets a little whatever looking, but it's just so interesting that some of them are pitch black, and you're like, okay, so did this white dude just turn pitch black? You know what I mean? So, but it's funny because, yeah, all in the science community and everything when it comes to the pyramids and everything when it comes to scientific community and scientific theories, until you have the evidence, because you can say that there was solar rays and that makes sense, and that explains the impossible, and that would make a lot of sense, and that would be ancient technology that's powerful, and it would explain all these things, and it would make sense, and there's evidence of it, and you can say that, there's this, and this is the evidence, and this can count as proof, and this is this, but the scientific, but there's no proof because we were there and nobody wrote it down on I don't know what proof would be, you know what I mean? But so it's just like okay, so in the science community everything's always hearsay. It's hearsay until you have any proof. It's always it's like the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trials, anytime you ever say anything, hearsay, hearsay, that's speculation, that's speculation, that's hearsay, where's your proof? Hearsay. So my reply to that nonsense then, since nothing's ever proven until you got proof, okay, so where's your experiments that ever said that if you bury a white person and you dig him up in 3,000 years, that he's going to be black? Because that's never been done. That has never been done. We don't know anything about the decomposition of bodies over hundreds or thousands of years, especially with the mummification process. We don't know what the mummification process does or why it's really there too much. You know what I mean? They could really be preserving their bodies. We don't have, what do they call it? We don't have a control, like in the science experiments. We don't have a control to test it against. We don't have anything to compare it to. We just know that, all these mummies are black. But it's funny because they're all from Africa. But it's just so funny because it's just they're just assuming the bodies rot and turn black. They're literally just assuming that. And maybe they're even lying on purpose. But it's funny because they've literally tested skin samples. It's a very easy thing you can do. It's very straightforward, basic. It's a little test. You just take a part of the mummy. Take any part of the freaking mummy. And it doesn't even have to be that big, and you can study it. And you know what they found? The mummies were actually just, they were black people. And sure, maybe we haven't tested every single mummy or whatever, but okay, they had a multicultural society. Okay, so some of them were black then, I guess, at least, or whatever. If you don't believe that they all were. At least some of them were.
So that we can observe them under a microscope. And we can absolutely see the degree of melanin under the skin of ancient Egyptians. There is enough left, despite the partial destruction of the epidermis.
But it's funny because in all their statues and all their paintings and all their everything, they have darker skin. Oh, it's funny because they're using white paint for their clothes and for the this and for the that and for the this. And on the same paintings where they have white paint, they're making their skin black. Or it's funny because they're using these statues that the material is just pitch black. And then they make the statue and then they paint it, except for the skin. They leave the skin just this pitch black stone. You know what I mean? They use all these stones that are pitch black, and they paint them, except for they keep their skin black, and you look at all the paintings, and they're like, all black skin, but then you look at some of the paintings, and you're like, oh, but there is white people next to black people. And you're like, oh, maybe they just didn't paint their skin white, because, you know, I'm not white, like, it's a different color than my white dress, so maybe they just made their skin a little darker to distinguish on their... No, okay, so they also made people with green skin in some of their things, so what does that mean? You know, who knows, you know what I mean? Could be aliens for all we know. Maybe it goes back to aliens. Great, now it's freaking aliens again. So, you know, but yeah, exactly, so we don't even know. But yeah, so there's paintings everywhere, and there's statues everywhere, and they're all just kind of black. It's really weird that everything's black. All the statues, all the bodies, all the paintings, all the everything. It's almost like all the white people who lived there just wanted to be black. So it's like, I don't know. It's ridiculous. So, you know, to clarify, you know, there was slavery in ancient Egypt at one point, but it's important to make the distinction that when there was chattel slavery in ancient Egypt, it's because that's when the Romans ruled. The Romans brought that there with them. So it's just interesting to think about that. That, oh, there wasn't slavery in ancient Egypt. Oh, I mean, there was later on, but that was after the Greeks took over. So, but it's important to make that distinction, though. I kind of came up with an analogy or like a metaphor or whatever. I was having this conversation with this chatbot, and I was trying to teach it about the miscommunications and the misinterpretations of ancient history. And it's funny because I made this sort of analogy or whatever you'd call it. I was like, it's almost like hearing somebody say that there was slavery in old-time America, and then somebody thinks, oh, old-time America, and then they think of Native Americans, and so then they just assume that Native Americans did slavery. They don't think that, you know, it's an example showing the historical ignorance of the history of a location. You know what I mean? You gotta think about the long history of a place. That's a good parallel or an example showing, you know, that's the same in ancient Egypt. When there was slavery, it was a different group of people. Certain groups of people have ruled that area at different times. You have to think about how it's had like 13 different governments. You gotta think about how it's had 13 different governments. It's traded hands 13 different times, so it's just like, I don't know, you gotta think about that. The pyramid was built by black people, and that's not even like a secret, really. You can Google that or whatever. But so, yeah, at the time that was happening, there was not slavery. So keep that in mind.